Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, I should say. Um, if you weren't here last time, we did go over in the Sheep and Goat 101 lots of different factors of just the basics on what you need to get going with on starting to show a sheep and goat project. With today's slides and presentation that we're going to go through, we're going to go a little bit more in depth. Some of the things we're going to cover are evaluating your project. And this will help you as an individual understand more about a little bit about anatomy and kind of understanding just what goes into making a good one, basically. And that'll help you in the future trying to pick out babies whenever you do go out to your breeders and select those animals to show. Just help you pick higher quality livestock that maybe some people don't see, and it might save you some money. If you can read some of those structural things, sometimes we can get one that's cheaper and is just a little greener than those ones that are fat and fleshy and ready to go. So that should help you. Another thing we're going to cover is nutrient requirements, and this is going to be kind of similar to some things I talked about last time, just in terms of understanding whether or not you have a really fast growing one or if you have a slow growing one, and how we need to change their diet depending on where you want to be at the end of the day size wise. And the last thing that we're going to cover as we go through here is we're going to cover, let me get to my last slide here, just make sure I'm right. We're going to analyze some structure, balance, design, things of that nature. And then we're going to go over some different common health issues that we have and that we see within sheep and goats. So I'm going to go ahead and start back at the beginning. Where we're going to start today is with evaluating your project. And like I said, I think these are some things that'll help you not only pick out better ones in the future, but will also just give you some indicators as we're going through the year with our project on what we can improve on. So as we get into evaluating your project, there's going to be three main things you want to evaluate for. First one's going to be fat, next one's going to be muscle, and the next one is going to be structure and or build. And guys, if y'all have any questions throughout this thing, please just let me know. This isn't going to be a very long presentation, but it should be very informational. These slides are very basic because they're more designed to go towards a live audience than a virtual audience. But if we need to have some pictures brought up here, I can always go on the internet and show y'all some examples as well. There's not many pictures in here. It's more, like I said, for a live audience, just to talk through it. I know visuals can be helpful sometimes, but in this particular slide, I'm more so going to talk and want you to listen to what I'm saying too, rather than just looking at pictures. So like I said, if you have any questions, please just, unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. And if someone will, Mel, is someone going to be watching that for me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So like I said, the first few things we're going to look at when we're evaluating your project is fat, muscle, structure, and build. Let's go through here and start. Okay, when we're analyzing fat, guys, the first place that we like to look for fat is up in the forerib. As you're studying that area, more so what we're going to do there than anything is not going to be visual. It's going to be tactile, which means we're going to be touching those animals and figuring out if they have any fat cover starting there, because all animals fatten from top to bottom, from front to back. Okay, so that's one of the first areas we're going to have an indication of cover or finish, is up through that forerib. Whenever you go in to touch those animals, you'll actually take your fingertips and go on both sides, right kind of behind their shoulder right there, into their, right above their armpit. You'll squeeze down in there and you'll actually feel if there's any fat depositing there. One good rule of thumb, it's an old school rule, but it still applies nonetheless, is if you'll make a fist with one of your hands, if you'll rub over your first knuckles back and forth, that would be one that's too lean. If you rub over the intersection of your knuckles between the base of your hand and those first set of knuckles, that'd be about ideal to have some cover. As you rub on the back side of your hand where it's completely flat and you can't feel any bumps or anything like that, which would be ribs, that's one that's maybe getting a little too fat. So it's just a little rule of thumb right there that'll help you kind of analyze in that particular area. I put center body right there, and that goes along with the next misconception about reading fat on sheep and goats. Sometimes we analyze too much how much center those animals are carrying. And when you start really looking at that, most of the time that's going to come out to be fill, or how much they've consumed during the day in terms of water or hay, which will make them look like, some people say, fat, but actually that's just the amount of fill and air that they have in their rumen that's actually poking that out. So as you take them off of feed and water to go to shows, that will come down, and that's not actually fat. Another place that we can analyze for fat is if we step right in behind those projects and you look around where their tail is, the base of where a sheep's tail was, which is called their dock, and or the base of a goat's tail, right on either side of that is going to be called pones. Those are two small nodules on either side in between the dock or base of the tail and their pin bones, which will fill up with fat. That's going to be something you see later in life, though, because that's probably the last place they're going to put on fat. So if you're seeing fat there already, you're probably a little too heavy finished, and we need to start pulling those things off of fat. So be wary of that, and just be cautious. Once you get to that point, it's really hard to get them back. So let's not get pones around their tail heads. Okay. Next area we need to focus on when it comes to evaluating your own project is analyzing muscle. And most of the time, I'm going to assume that a lot of people that are on here are showing market animals instead of breeding animals. There's a little difference between this. If we're talking about muscle on market animals, we're going to be more emphasized on whether or not they have muscle than the breeding side of things. If we're analyzing muscle for market goats or market lambs, some of the main areas that we look for muscle is obviously the rack. That's right in behind the shoulder blades. That really squared up muscle is what you want back there, one that's really shapely. You want that to stand up and be square in its shape. You want it to be firm. As we get more mature and those livestock projects put on more finish, it's probably going to get bigger, and it's probably going to get a little softer to touch than those really green babies who don't have any fat on them. But that's okay. We don't, as long as it's the right shape and it's upstanding, that's all we're looking for there. As we move back from there, you're going to get past that last rib, which is going to be called the hind saddle. The last rib, from the last rib back to where their hip starts, that's called the loin. You want that to be really wide and flat as you handle those things down the top side of their skeleton. We want them to progressively get wider as we go from the rack back into their loin and then back into their hip. So that's what we call wedgie in their design. We'll get into that later, talking about structure and design, but that's just a good term to know. We want them to progressively get wider from the rack to their loin to their hip. Another good place to analyze muscle is talking about the rump. This is going to be called the leg of sheep or the leg of the goat. As we look back there, we want it to be round in appearance. We don't want the top side of the hip to be round, but we want the muscle shape underneath that in their leg to be full. We want it to be really wide and have a lot of muscle as we carry down towards the hock. That's something that's very key. Sometimes we have animals that muscle sits really high and it doesn't carry down quite as far. If you're analyzing babies, that's something to look at. We want that muscle to carry really far down in the leg and not be so jam-packed and up onto its skeleton that doesn't run down enough. So that's another good place to analyze muscle is in the rump. I put body shape in this slide because I think that this is one of the most important indicators when you are analyzing young sheep and young goats that people don't really look at or consider. If you were in the first presentation where we talked about body shape as, again, one thing that I think is very important, what we want to remember is that we can always put more mass and more shape on top of a round, bold body shape than we do a flat, narrower body shape. So we want their body shape to be robust and round, especially up through their forerib, like we talked about earlier. We want them to be wide-based, and we want them to have a lot of body shape and capacity. This facilitates for more muscle shape. It also facilitates for them to being more capacious, being able to intake more feed to convert that into overall muscle and just shape. So some really good things to look at, really good things to consider is body shape and base width. Those go along with muscle hand in hand. Okay. Does anybody have any questions yet?
Not in the chat box so far.
Okay. We will move on then. Here as we start, we continue to analyze our project. This gets into some of the more advanced things to look at that if you are a new feeder on here listening in, we really, if you don't understand this fully, I would definitely go talk to your ag teacher or your extension agent and get them to help you understand this. Structure and design is something that is learned over a long period of time. It comes along with just years of looking at livestock and understanding what makes one structurally sound as well as balance up, what we like to call it, where they paint a really pretty picture from the side. That takes into account their chest floor, their flank, their spine, hip and hind leg design. We can get really, really detailed with this, but just for starters right here, as we start looking at design and structure, the first thing I like to look at is to make sure that they are correct in their feet and their legs. What I mean by that is we want all 4 feet pointing north and south. We want their feet to be square. As you read those things in their toes, those things should be even and should be square. If you have one longer than the other, especially significantly, we can get into some major issues talking about their legs, where they will either roll out in their hocks or their knees, or they'll come in vice versa. They can either be pigeon-toed where their knees flare out or their hocks flare out, or we can be sickle-hocked or cow-hocked where their hocks will come in severely and their toes will point outward. So we really want to pay attention to that as we start looking at these things. And what I may do, if it's okay with Mel, is I may switch over here in a minute to my other slide to come back to this structure and design thing to kind of give them some visual to look at here in a minute. I've got a couple slides on that other one that I forgot to transfer over here. When we're talking about spine, guys, which is the next thing we need to analyze, a lot of the times where I've seen people mess up is we don't pay attention to their spine whenever we buy these things. As babies, when they are really skinny and they're not fat and fleshy, we can really get down and analyze on where this thing is sitting in their body cavity. A lot of the times what you'll see is on young sheep and young goats, if they do have a problem there, it'll be much more significant than later in life, to where they'll be a little high in their spine, where they'll look almost like they've got a curvature, or they always stay humped up a little bit. Their spine, if that's wrong from the beginning, that's something you can never fix. We need to make sure that that's not a factor. Okay, so make sure we pay attention to the spine. Again, as we're talking about design and structure, when we look up here and you say, man, why does he have the word solo cup on here? If we think about balance, and this is one of the things I was talking about to be a little bit more advanced, is we want to picture sheep and goats as a red solo cup that's laid on its side. If you picture a solo cup laying on its side, we've got a narrower end, which is the bottom of the cup. We've got a larger end down here, which is the opening of the cup. If we lay it down sideways, that's the kind of body shape and design we like to see in sheep and goats, to where they are shallower and tighter up through their front end, and we progressively get deeper and more productive in its shape towards their flank and their center body. This makes them look like they run uphill more. Also, it takes into account that body shape I was talking about, where it needs to be round and bold for them to have enough capacity to take in that feed and convert it to muscle and finish like we need them to. Also, if we're talking about their lines, like I was talking about earlier, with their chest floor back into their flank, we need to be tighter up through their chest floor and shallower, and progressively get deeper back to their flank. And then that takes into account their spine as well. We want their spine to be level as we're showing those animals. So just a little bit to hit on there. And I'm going to go back, like I said, on my other presentation. I'm going to pull that up here in a minute. We're going to go over that just a little bit more so y'all have some visual to look at. As we dive into our next slide, let's do that. We're going to talk about nutrient requirements. And I touched on this slightly during the 101 presentation. But there's a lot of factors to consider when we're talking about a fat versus a lean sheep or goat, okay? And this goes along with whether or not you want to have a large animal at the end of the day or a small animal. And what I mean by that is the only way to get a sheep and a goat to slow down their rate of gain is by getting those sheep and goats fatter, faster. So the earlier we get a sheep and goat fat, the more likely he is to shut down his rate of gain, and he will continue to stay small. If we have a sheep or goat that remains lean for longer into his lifespan, the faster he's going to grow and the bigger he's going to be at the end of the day. Now, where you're wanting to be weight-wise by the time you get to your county or whatever major you're going to, kind of steers you in the direction, well, do I want to get him fatter sooner? Do I want to keep him lean and let him grow some more? Those are all things to consider when we're talking about fat versus lean. Obviously, when we want to get one fatter, we need to increase the caloric intake for those sheep or goats. So they need more calories. We're going to emphasize those calories more towards the fat side of the feed and a lower protein content. When you decrease the protein content in a feed and increase the fat, clearly we're going to make one fatter sooner. So those are things that you need to be familiar with when you buy your feed. You can always ask them or whoever you're getting your feed from, you can ask them to look at the label. Or you can just ask the guys that are working at your feed store, which one is higher fat and lower protein. And they can usually point you in the right direction for that. And so that's something you need to look at when we want it, or if we have an animal that is too fat and we want to lean him out and make him grow some more. This is part of the nutrient requirement that we need to increase the protein and decrease the fat. So these two are complete opposites when you're talking about nutrient requirements. For nutrient requirements, when we're talking about fill, this is another thing that I think is underrated when people start, feeding these things out, and they get scared when they get home, and they've fed a little too much hay, and it looks like those things are really, really full. My experience, when you keep one full, and with fill, that's using some type of a roughage or a forage like alfalfa or coastal, Sudan, hay grazer, any of those that you use as a ruminant stimulant, the better. The more you use, the better. People get scared of it because, well, you feed it to them and they don't look good, like they're going to go to a show. Well, at some point we have to let these things just be sheep and goats. They're meant to digest forages and roughages, and we got to make sure that we keep that in their diet. If we don't keep that in their diet, like I said, I think for being a ruminant stimulant, I think fill in the form of a roughage is unbeatable. It's that actual fibrous material that they intake breaks down and gets into the rumen and scratches the walls of the rumen, which is good for the microorganism to develop. The bugs that they've got inside of their rumen that actually digest the feed, it stimulates those and makes them work a little bit harder. Another thing that we gain with fill or roughage is we expand their body shape. So like I said, sometimes people will feed it and those things get really heavy centered and look like they're carrying too much belly. That's something that's good in my opinion. The more we keep those animals full to where they look a little too full and like they're carrying too much middle, the more we mold those young ribs in those animals to take on more shape. So maybe you've got one that needs some more shape to his rib cage. We can aid that by increasing fill or a roughage. Keeping those in those young animals is something that I think, again, is very underrated. And the one thing that I said, again, fat versus lean animals, the only way to slow the rate of gain in sheep or goats is to get them fat early. Okay, let me see if I can pull up my slide again. There it is. Okay. Before I get to this next slide, which I'm going to get to some common health issues that we see with sheep and goats, I don't care if you put it in the chat box or if you unmute your mic and talk to me about it. I want to hear from y'all some common health issues y'all have seen. if you've had these livestock projects, I want to hear what y'all have experienced having new sheep or goats in the barn. We're getting the later part of the season. Have you had anything this year that you've seen that is a health issue that maybe you want to discuss?
I think coccidiosis is one of the things that, that we've had trouble with at times, that you really have to get on top of fast.
Okay.
And that's probably one of the things that we watch for the most, I think.
Okay.
In addition to respiratory issues, especially when it's really hot during the day and then gets cold and the weather gets kind of crazy.
Perfect. Okay. So that's a good point too. I actually didn't put the respiratory issues in here because once we get to respiratory issues, sometimes, especially during those fast acting ones, that's something we want to go to a vet to pretty quickly. That maybe we don't want to take so many precautions as a home remedy to get rid of. But there are a few things that we can do to eliminate those things, and that's a very good point. We'll just go ahead and start off with that. When it comes to respiratory issues, some of the big things that we see from that is, and I don't know where y'all get y'all sheep and goats from, but a lot of the times what we see is anything that comes from a more northern region, whether that's North Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, Iowa. I don't know where you're getting them from, but anytime we get sheep and goats from up north, they have a harder time acclimating to our climate down here. And the main reason for that is we're not only hotter, we are higher in moisture content in the air. It's a lot more humid here. And one thing that that's one thing they struggle with. With that added moisture, we are intaking more moisture into the lungs. And because those things are genetically programmed to be up north, because that's what they're born in, as soon as they come out of the womb and they're laid on the ground, their body automatically starts adapting to where they're born in the climate that they're in. With a drier air that's usually cooler, their bodies automatically say, here's where we're going to grow up and spend the rest of our lives, and their lungs don't develop for the type of climate that we have down here. So one thing I would say for anybody who's getting animals from up north, we dang sure want to make sure that we have those things. We have some certain, medicines in mind. One of the good medicines, the best medicines, I think, for anything respiratory is going to be Nuflor or Resflor. Those are antibiotics more geared towards respiratory issues. And a couple of ways that we can identify respiratory issues, in my opinion, and they may sound rudimentary, but if they're coughing, I don't consider a dry cough as much of an issue as a wet cough. And what I mean by that is if they're coughing and it sounds like there's a lot of mucus or a lot of moisture or a phlegm to that cough, that's when we need to start getting concerned. And usually that wetter cough will come with some other indicators, such as snot running out of their nose that's an off color. If it's still clear, that's better. But when we get to that point that they're coughing and there's a phlegm, and we see some residue coming out of their nose that is off colored, whether it's white or it's yellow, that's when we've got a severe respiratory infection or some type of a pneumonia that's coming on. At that point, the sooner we catch it, the better. The more likely we are to get those things out of it and go ahead and medicate them with and get them over that respiratory issue. And I would say once we're to that point, we dang sure need to call a vet and get the proper prescription into those things, the right injectable to knock that out of them and get them over it. Because if they stay in that for very long, we can sure cause some permanent lung damage. And once that's happened, it sure is hard for them to come out of it. As we get into our next topic, which Miss Bauer covered as well, coccidiosis is a big one. I tend to see that more in the goat field than I do the sheep world. But nonetheless, I think that's an extremely important issue and one that is misdiagnosed quite often. Anytime, and I like to do it throughout the year on show stock, is getting fecal samples done. This not only tells you whether or not you've got this coccidiosis bacteria or if you've got an internal parasite load, which covers another topic that I've already got up here, and these can go hand in hand. Throughout the year, and I know people as extreme as they get it done every month, go out and collect some fecal samples in a bag or a container and take that to your vet. He'll put it under a microscope, and he can tell you whether or not you've got an internal parasite load or you've got coccidiosis. That's a good way to start off and identify it. With coccidiosis, there's some difference between just regular old scours and coccidiosis. If we think that we have coccidiosis, and we take a stool sample in and we get that verified, we need to go ahead and get a product into those sheep or goats. The one thing that I like to use that has never let me down yet is Corid, a great product. You can buy that in a powder form as well as a liquid form. It works extremely well. I like to use the powdered form myself, and I like to mix the concentrate version instead of putting it in the water bucket, because I know exactly how much medication they're getting every day, and it doesn't depend on whether or not they drink that day or not. We're actually putting that medication in those sheep and goats with a drench gun, and we know exactly how much they're getting. And that's one thing that I think has really done a good job at keeping up with the times. That, you know, they've reformulated a couple times, and they've really stoutened it up a little bit to deal with some resistance that we have with that bacteria. I think it's a go-to, and I think it's really easy to get your hands on it, and it's affordable, and it works. Like I said, with an internal parasite load, I know that a lot of people preach on small ruminants that if we have these things, you know, dry lotted, which most of our show sheep and goats are, they are in a pen where they don't have any free range to go graze on an open pasture. Lots of professors say, well, we're not going to pick up any internal parasites unless we are grazing. I think it's pretty cheap insurance to go ahead and worm at least once a month and rotate your wormers to make sure you're not only catching your flatworms and your tapeworms, but we're also catching our roundworms, like our brown stomach worms, our barber pole worms, things of that nature. If we have an internal parasite load in our show sheep or show goats, I don't care how much you feed those things or how much caloric intake they have. If we have an internal parasite load, they're not going to perform the way that we need to. They're not going to take that feed, and it's not going to be used by the ruminant organisms to convert into fat and into muscle like we need them to, and you will always be behind the eight ball when it comes to putting on muscle and fat. So I think it's pretty cheap insurance for everybody to just go ahead and make sure we're worming those things every month, and we like to change wormers, moving from like a Cydectin to a Prohibit. Thank you. Yes, Prohibit is in my opinion the best wormer on the market right now. The one thing that you've got to be careful with on Prohibit versus the rest of the sheep and goat wormers that we have on the market is it's a lot stouter, and we have a lot higher likelihood of overdosing those and getting ourselves in trouble by killing the liver in those sheep and goats. So we've got to be very careful and make sure we follow the label on that one. We need to follow the label on all of them, but that one is very strict on how much you give to them based on body weight. I know that from personal experience. We run a lot of commercial sheep and goats, and we've had a couple fall over dead on us. So we really don't want that to happen to your show stock, because I know they cost a lot more than my commercial goats. Another common health issue I see, especially when we get into school barns where we have a lot of them in there, is pink eye. As we start looking for that, if they have any type of flushing of the eye where you're seeing those eyes run a bunch or they're tear stained, and you open that eyelid and see that it's really red inside there, or that they're blinking a lot, closing one eye like it's hurting them, generally that's pink eye. A couple remedies to that. If you can get your hands on penicillin, what we've seen is that if you take that penicillin, draw it up in a syringe, and directly squirt that into the eye, please don't inject the eyeball. We've had people do that in the past. Don't take a needle and inject the actual eyeball. Just squirt the penicillin into the eye. from a distance. That seems to be a very good remedy. There's lots of different products out there. I don't care if it's an NFZ puffer, which you can buy at Tractor Supply. Vetricin has come out with a new product that's a pink eye spray. I've heard it works really well. This particular problem we see is one that spreads very easily. So anytime a fly will land on the eye of a sheep or goat that is affected by it, and they go to another sheep and goat and land around their eye, they're going to spread that. So we want to get that knocked out really quickly. If you don't catch it in time, pink eye can cause blindness, permanent blindness. So we really want to get that taken care of. Another point that I wanted to hit on this, whenever I was talking earlier about scours, of having regular scours versus coccidiosis. If we have regular scours, there's a very simple solution. We need to take them off some of the feed that we're giving them. Sometimes scours are simply caused by overfeeding. When we have sheep and goats, they are very susceptible to, especially if we're feeding a really high-powered roughage or hay like alfalfa, as well as our high-powered show feeds. Sometimes there's too much caloric intake, too much molasses, and too much sugar in that combination that it just simply upsets their stomach. They get the scours. You can use anything from like Spectogard, or you can use kaopectin. Lots of different remedies for regular scours, but most of the time, if you have the scours like that, you just simply take them off feed, put them on a really low quality forage like Coastal. That will clear them up as well and kind of settle their gut back down. That's just a point that I wanted to make here. Does anybody have any questions yet?
I don't see any in the chat box.
Okay, what I'm going to do, Mellanie, is I'm going to go down here and I'm going to pull up my old, let's see here, let me open this up. I'm going to go open up the first one, and I want to kind of go back over some of the balance stuff that I talked about. Let's go right here. All right, we're back on this one, the initial one, okay? I wanted to go back over this because I think it's a big point to talk about just in terms of balance and structure. I wanted to hit this again because this is something that it does take a little bit more visual to understand. With structure, like I was talking about, feet and legs, this is something that we would call post-legged, where we don't have enough set in their hock and their pastern, and it looks way too upright and too straight, and this limits mobility. This is what we'd call sickle-hocked, where we have too much set, and you can see they drew this line just to kind of give you an illustration of that's not supposed to be there. Everything's supposed to be in line like this last one, where we have enough set here, enough set at the pasture, and everything kind of lines up here. And you can see that the mobility issue here is whenever we get those feet and legs too straight up and down, their legs are always going to be posted up underneath them, which limits mobility. So this is kind of some rear leg structure we want to watch out for. Like I was talking about earlier with pigeon-toed or kneeing in, which are two opposite ones. As their feet point outward, we're going to see more a concave shape to the knee, where it'll come back into them. Their knee can come forward like this one. This is kind of what we want to see ideal, is straight up and down with no deflection on sheep and goats. They're square-toed, knees in line with the shoulder. We can see that in this one. Everything's pretty straight line. His shoulder has still got a 45-degree angle and it's laid back to it. Enough. When we're driving sheep, obviously that hock's going to come further back, or goats, that hock's going to be further back. But when this sheep's walking, he looks more like this, where everything's in line. Really good built one. While we're here, we're going to talk about balance. Actually, we can go to this one, see some more structural issues like we see. That's where I was talking about where they hock out or hock in. This is one that's way more severe. I'd be much more concerned with this than I would this, because there are some remedies we can do to fix this just with feet trimming and or using a treadmill. We can correct this a little bit. If you have one that these hocks are bowing out really bad like this, there's not much you can do for it, and it's really going to dock you in the show ring. Balance, here's what I was trying to draw earlier but was not successful at all. red solo cup on the side. This would be the sheep's flank back here and hip. This would be where his front legs are. This would be his chest floor and his forerib coming back. As we see, we progressively get deeper as we come back in here to make him look a little bit more productive. And this is what I'm talking about with balance. If you picture this, look back at this one, really tight and shallow up through his forerib, progressively gets deeper back into his center body and back into his flank back here. Really wedgy designed one. That's what I wanted to hit on as we started talking about that. But does anybody have any further questions? I'm about done, and we're right at 40 minutes. That's actually longer than I thought it was going to take, but I'm glad that I covered a lot of material there. If y'all have any questions, please give them to us now.
And y'all are welcome to unmute yourselves or type them in the chat.
Wayne, thank you overall, because this is something for Clay to, he will be showing next year. I showed when I was younger, but this is going to be, next year will be his first year showing lambs. So he's trying to understand it a little bit more.
It's a lot to take in, but like I said, if you've got any questions whenever you go to pick out livestock for next year, take an extension agent with you, take an ag teacher with you. If you're not 100% certain, I'd sure make sure you take somebody who's got some experience, so you get the most bang for your buck. Like I said, if you understand some of these attributes before you get into the show world, it'll save you some money, because a lot of the times what they're selling you is fat on those babies. The ones that get ready early, they sell for a lot more money. Whenever we're going into buying private treaty or we're at sales, those just seem to bring more money than even some of those better built ones that have a better future in front of them. So,
yes, sir.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate it.
Thank y'all. I appreciate y'all.
Thanks, Wayne. We really appreciate your time tonight.
No problem. Y'all have a wonderful evening. And if y'all have any questions for Mel or y'all think of anything, email her and she can get with me anytime.
Absolutely.
All righty. Thank y'all. Y'all have a good evening.
Thanks, y'all. We'll see you later.